All right, welcome everyone for this 2026 Mattersdorff-Steinhardt lecture. It's a great pleasure to have Professor Colburn here. So Professor Colburn is coming from the University of Washington, where he is the Marshall and J. Glaser Endowed University Professor and Associate Professor at the Runstad Department of Real Estate. And he will come here today to talk about a very hot topic, housing, and what we can do about it. So please welcome him and have a great lecture.
Now to get the slides up. For some reason the power wasn't working, which is why we had a little problem, and I appreciate your patience. And we are about ready to roll. Ta-da! Okay, thank you for having me, Lewis and Clark. It's great to be here. I'm sorry my voice is a little scratchy. I was on conference calls all day and then speaking this afternoon, so I'm going to drink water and keep going here. It's great to be in Portland. Our son is actually at Whitman and lost to Lewis and Clark in the Ultimate Frisbee National Tournament last year. So, yep. So that was, when I told him I was coming, he rolled his eyes a little bit. So anyway, it's a great school. I'm a big fan of liberal arts education. We got 2 kids at liberal arts schools. I went to liberal arts school, and so I'm envious that you get to do this. It's one of the best times of my life was the 4 years I spent as an undergrad. So thank you for being here tonight. I know there's lots of other things you could do besides hearing about homelessness. But I am glad you're here, and this is a topic that affects everyone, and so I look forward to the questions that you have. So I'm going to talk for a while, and then I look forward to having a conversation and hearing from you and your perspectives and questions that you might have. So I shared some of this with some students this afternoon, but I come to this work with kind of a strange career path. I graduated from college and went into the investment field in New York, Chicago, and Minneapolis, and did that for about 17 years. And in that time was pretty self-absorbed in my own world and doing my own thing, but always had this lingering desire to be an academic and go back to graduate school. And so finally, when I was turning 40, I decided to do that, and happened to be at the University of Minnesota with Anya, your lovely economics faculty member here. And so it's fun to have our paths cross again here at Lewis and Clark. And so when I was on the job market, I was fortunate enough to get a position at the University of Washington, and moving to a place that is one of the epicenters of the homelessness and housing crisis as a housing scholar was kind of interesting. So I immediately got thrown into the deep end and was invited to all these community conversations around housing and homelessness. And the motivation for this book and this study was my observation that we as a community didn't understand what was going on. And that you could easily reach that conclusion by reading the Seattle Times every day. And I'm sure you have the same situation in Portland, where there's a different narrative, a different explanation for homelessness. Everyone agrees it's a problem, everyone's irritated about it, but there's no understanding of what's going on. And so the purpose of this book was really to explain some forces and drivers that we've known for a long time in the academic literature for a general audience of general audience of readers, who are walking around Seattle going, what the heck is going on? I was just in Chicago, it wasn't like this, okay? So that's what this book was intended to do, and I didn't think anyone would read it, to be perfectly honest. And now people have read it, and I've had a chance to talk all over the world on this book, which has really been a great privilege for me and a huge surprise. And so this isn't gonna be a real wonky talk, but we will talk a little bit about statistical relationships and things like that. But I think the one thing that I really want to highlight for you is that there's a simple question that motivates this, which is what causes homelessness? And that's a simple question with a super, super complicated answer, okay? I've never experienced homelessness. I've never experienced housing precarity. And so I don't speak from experience at all, right? But I've talked to a lot of people who have. And so I'm not going to stand up here and say this is the one causal pathway into homelessness. That would be disingenuous, and I'm in no position to say that. But what we can talk about is what contexts produce homelessness at higher levels. So what we have with homelessness is a classic problem that we would call in the academy a unit of analysis problem. What causes homelessness for an individual? We'll talk about that. If you're poor, if you're mentally ill, if you're addicted, if you're physically disabled, you're more likely to experience homelessness. Why does Seattle and Portland and San Francisco and LA, Boston and New York and DC have a lot of homelessness? The answer to that question is different. So depending on the unit of analysis at which you're focused, the causal explanation is different. And that's what messes all of us up. Because when we walk down 3rd Avenue in Seattle, and I don't know what the equivalent is in Portland, but where homelessness congregates, it's very easy to draw a causal relationship between Joe on the street with a needle next to him and homelessness. And that then shapes our understanding and then kind of pushes public narrative in that direction. Okay. So from a scholarship standpoint, a lot of the scholarship on homelessness over the last couple of decades has been very individually focused. Right? That research was being done in schools of social work, schools of nursing, public health, medicine. Okay? And that's worthy and important research, and it's trying to figure out why is Gregg likely to experience homelessness, or what interventions will help Gregg if Gregg's experiencing homelessness. Okay? A very small segment of the research was trying to figure out why is this happening at such high levels in certain places, and that's what this book is about. And so I've had the opportunity to visit and go to a lot of cool spots in the last 3 years. And in 2024, in the fall of 2024, right before the election, I had the opportunity to go to DC and meet with the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, which is the federal agency that oversees housing. And that was a really cool experience, and to have a chance to speak to a cabinet secretary about this. And so my task with one other person, they invited 20 people, 4 groups. I was in the homelessness group, and they said, you need to write a 3-page memo on how to end homelessness in the United States. I was like, anything else you want me to do? Okay, so we put our heads together and gave it the college try and wrote 3 pages on how we'd end homelessness in the United States, and I presented it then to this group and senior members of HUD, and I started the talk with a parable, and I'm going to share the parable with you today because I think it's relevant to this conversation. This is a parable that has its roots in Africa. Called the Parable of the River. So there's a village in Africa along a river. And the people in this village are going about their day, and one day they see a baby in a basket floating down the river. And they're alarmed by this, they've never seen that before, and a woman then rushes into the water, grabs the basket to save the baby, and begins to care for this baby. They don't know where the baby came from. The next day, another baby's floating down the river. Pretty soon, there's all sorts of babies floating down the river, and an entire ecosystem has developed in this community to care for these babies. And it's important, good work. And pretty soon, this is occupying a lot of their day because they have so many babies to care for, and there's still more babies coming down the river. And one day, someone decides to leave this village and this important work, and they start walking away, and they kind of judgingly say, where are you going? We have work to do here. And this person turned to them and said, I'm going to go find out who's putting all these babies in the river. Okay? The work that I'm doing is a little bit like the person heading upstream. Okay? Why in the world do we have all these people entering homelessness? It's really important to do the good work of figuring out how do we care for people once we're there, but I'm more interested in reducing the flow into homelessness. That, to me, is the durable way to reduce or end homelessness in the United States. We cannot treat our way out of this. I firmly believe that. And so this book is really kind of entering the conversation of saying, what's the deal with the inflow? We can have the conversation about the existing interventions and treatments, and that's important. But what is going on with the inflow? That's what this is really, dealing with, okay? And generally speaking, when you read an article about homelessness interventions in the newspaper, it's talking about the outflow. It's talking about the crisis response and how do we deal with that, okay? That occupies probably 90% of our conversation when, in fact, I think we should be focusing elsewhere. Okay. And we also see this kind of dichotomy in the academy. I joke that it's my mission to pull homelessness and housing research together. I have many colleagues who say, oh, no. I study housing, I don't study homelessness. Or, I study homelessness, I don't do anything about housing. I'm like, they're the same thing. Okay. So I think bringing these strands together is super important. So that's kind of what motivated me to write the book. This is the book. And came out in 2022, so we've been at this 3 years now, 4 years. Next month it'll be 4 years, I can't believe it. And as I mentioned, it has been a complete shock and honor to go all over the country and the world talking about this book, to big places like New York City and to small places like Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and Australia and Europe and all over the place. I got invited to go to Santiago, Chile to talk about the book, and I wasn't able to go. It's a long way away. Would have liked to. And so what this has taught me is, one, I've learned a ton every place that I go. It has also taught me that the stories are the same. Not identical, but pretty darn similar. I see a lot of similarities around the country of just growing problems, growing housing precarity, and increasing concern about homelessness. Cedar Rapids, Iowa is not Portland. I was getting interviewed by a news person there, and he said, "Tell us why you're here." I told him the story. He said, "Well, have you been walking around?" I said, "Yeah, I went for a run this morning." And he said, "Did you see the homelessness?" I said, "Well, I saw one person." And I almost was ready to kind of be like, "What are you talking about?" And what I realized for them is going from 0 to 1 is scary. They've been at 0 for a long time, and all of a sudden there's visible homelessness, and they're saying, "Oh, okay, this is a problem." And what I said was, like, harness that attention. I'm glad that you're concerned about that, because you don't want to get to the point where you now have 50,000 people, right, or more, which is the case in New York and LA, right? So this is a new slide that I've been putting together because I've been thinking about these issues for a long time, and I have a lot of time on planes, and so I was sketching this out on a flight recently. And the reason I sketched this out is I want to put the conversation of homelessness within the broader narrative or context of the housing crisis in the United States, okay? And I highlighted homelessness at the top in yellow because that's the topic here, but there are other consequences of this crisis. Third grade teachers who can't afford to live in Seattle and now have an hour commute, right, to teach for the Seattle public school system. That's a consequence of the housing crisis. Reduced economic mobility because people can't move or take different jobs because of housing costs. That's a consequence. Huge burdens at the household level. I can't pay for food. I can't pay for enrichment for my kids because of housing costs. That's a consequence, right? And so what I say to folks is the housing crisis is the same crisis for Joe on the street as it is for the third grade teacher. The consequences are just different for those different households. Okay? And so we have to stop thinking about this being an independent problem. What we have are forces like a lack of housing supply and different preferences for housing and economic growth and inequality and a lack of federal support for housing and a lack of innovation in the construction industry. All of these things have come together to produce an inadequate supply of housing in the United States that has had profound consequences. So we're going to zero in one element of that, but I want you to have that broader context as we're thinking about that. Okay, so now we're going to get into this conversation about causation. Okay. So again, if you were to say, and you were just poll someone on the streets in Portland, what causes homelessness, you might get one of these answers. Okay. And this actually comes from the survey that we do every year in January when we count homelessness. We also conduct interviews with people who are experiencing homelessness to ask them about their experiences. Why are you homeless? What led you to this condition? And what you get when you hear those responses is everything under the sun. Okay, and I thought a lot about this slide as I was putting the book together. Because my primary fear was, having been through and conducted these interviews, is that I knew there might be a woman saying, my boyfriend beat me up and I ran and now I'm homeless. Okay, we need to honor that explanation, right? Because that's her experience. And I'm here wearing a blue sport coat saying it's the housing market. Okay, one of these isn't right and one isn't wrong, they're both true. What she's talking about, the circumstances that led to her experiencing homelessness, what I'm talking about is the broader context that produces conditions to create more homelessness. But generally speaking, addiction, job loss, domestic violence, those are what we think about, and they are the individual causes of homelessness. But as we pose in the book, and as I was thinking about the domestic violence and housing conundrum, what I came to was to draw a distinction in the book between what we call root causes and precipitating events. Both are true, so we don't pit them against each other as explanations. They're complementary explanations of a complex phenomenon. Okay? The domestic violence event that this woman experienced was the precipitating event that led to her experiencing homelessness. And the root cause might be a lack of affordable housing, right? Relational breakdown can absolutely be a cause of homelessness, but I always say, and my wife has heard me give this talk more times than she'd like, she's like, why do you keep talking about us getting divorced? We're not getting divorced, by the way, but if we were to get divorced tonight, neither of us would be homeless tomorrow, right? So the context in which relational breakdown happens really matters. For one couple, that could lead to a very downward spiral quickly, while others could, painful, but would be able to survive that because of resources and networks and all those types of things, right? So the way that we highlight this in the book, and Clay and I, my co-author, had a disagreement about this. He didn't want to put it in the book. He said it was sophomoric, and I was like, that's the point. So I won that argument. Game of musical chairs. You know how the game's played. 10 friends, 10 chairs. We start the music. Everyone's walking around in a circle. We pull one chair out. We now have 9 chairs. Okay? Music stops. Everyone scrambles for a chair, and by definition, someone loses. Okay? So I'm a big sports fan. If ESPN were there, as we always do in interview, like, why did you lose the Super Bowl? If we asked Mike, who was on crutches, why he lost the game, he would say, I had a bad ankle. Right? When the scramble ensued because he had a bad ankle, he didn't get there quick enough, and he lost. And if we were to ask him, like we do in homelessness surveys, why are you homeless? Why'd you lose the game? What would you focus on? My individual vulnerability. I had a bad ankle. And everyone would nod. Yeah, Mike had a bad ankle. That's why he lost the game. But if we ask a different question, which is, why didn't Mike have a chair? It's because we didn't have 10 chairs. Had we had 10 chairs, Mike would have found a chair. It might have taken him longer. It might not have been pretty, but he would have hobbled his way to a chair. And so while overly simplistic, this is exactly what's going on in our coastal cities. In Seattle, what I joke about is, finding housing in Seattle in the midst of an Amazon boom is like playing musical chairs with Usain Bolt. Do you remember Usain Bolt? Jamaican sprinter, fastest man in the world. Like, Usain Bolt's gonna win musical chairs every time. The people working at Amazon are gonna win that game every time. I have a lot of friends who work at Amazon. Not one of them is experiencing homelessness, right? They all found a spot. So the problem with this is that when someone then loses that game and Joe's on 5th Avenue or 3rd Avenue in Seattle, and everyone says, well, of course Joe's homeless, he's addicted. Of course Mike lost the game, he was on crutches. And what we miss in that simple analysis is a structural deficit of housing, and in particular affordable housing, that's creating the conditions for Joe to have that experience. And then we, in our minds, equate homelessness with Joe's particular condition. And we miss this larger structural driver, which is frankly the elephant in the room that we're not spending enough time on. And so that's my personal mission, is to get us to focus on that. This doesn't mean that treatment isn't necessary. This doesn't mean that the fentanyl crisis isn't real. Of course it is. As I've said to elected leaders, we can do 2 things at one time. We can have a robust behavioral health response, and we can build housing. These aren't mutually exclusive things. I won't speak for Oregon because I don't know your stats. Our behavioral response in Washington has been grossly inadequate. And has that accentuated and complicated the homelessness crisis? Yes, it has. Okay. But that alone will not end this, right? I say that if I had a magic wand, I wish I did, and I could end all mental illness and substance use disorder in Seattle. 1, I would wave the wand, and 2, we'd still have a problem with homelessness. It might manifest itself a little differently, but the reality is this problem, the structural deficit of housing, doesn't go away if we can somehow cleanse people of all behavioral health challenges. So as I said, we have abundant research that shows that drug use, mental illness, poverty cause homelessness at the individual level. Okay. But we also know that those conditions exist in every jurisdiction in the United States. So why is homelessness so much more prevalent in Boston than it is in St. Louis, for example, right? That's the purpose of this book. The other point that's super important on homelessness is that we walk around Portland or Seattle, we see people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, chronic homelessness, and we equate that interaction with homelessness in general. I describe unsheltered homelessness as the tip of the iceberg, the part of the iceberg that's above the water that we see. What we don't see is women and children in family shelters. What we don't see is people living in their cars, showering at the YMCA, and then going to their job. There's an entire world of people who are experiencing housing precarity that we don't see. And therefore, we look at the tip of the iceberg and say, that's homelessness. It is an important part of homelessness, but it's not the full experience. Okay? Which is why it's easy for people to then equate behavioral health and homelessness as the cause, because that's what we see. So I don't blame people for reaching that conclusion, but I do blame people for ignoring the evidence when it's presented to them. And that's kind of the fight that we're in right now. So the question that we ask in the book is a pretty simple one, which is, why do per capita rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? Why does Seattle have 5 times the per capita homelessness of Chicago? Right? That's huge variation. It's not 20% more, 30% more, it's 5 times. And the reason we ask that question is I firmly believe that if we can provide a credible answer to that question, it should tell us something fundamental about the nature of the problem. And therefore, if we're an elected leader or someone who's caring for a city, we can say, you know, we should probably focus on that issue, at least some, if that's what's driving this. And so when we think about regional variation, then we have to start to think, well, what is causing this regional variation? A lot of people, including people in very, very significant positions of power in the United States, have made the argument that if you just have more people with individual vulnerabilities, you'll have more homelessness. If you have a city with lots of poor people, lots of people who are addicted, and a lot of people who are mentally ill, you'll have more homelessness. And that's a plausible explanation. Turns out it's absolutely false. It doesn't stop people from making that argument, though. So this is a book about cities. It's not a book about people. And I purposely, when the publisher came back with the cover of the book, they had a traditional homelessness cover, which is, as you can imagine, what it is. A person sitting on the street. And I said, oh, no, 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 we're not doing that. And so actually my wife is a graphic designer, and so she designed our cover. I wanted housing on the front. Okay? This is not a story about Joe. Does Joe deserve our care and dignity? Of course. This is a book about cities. Why is it so bad in Portland and Seattle? And let's figure that out and then do something about it. That's what this is. And our thesis is that tight housing markets, places where housing is expensive and scarce, accentuate individual vulnerabilities and produce homelessness at really high levels, right? The individual vulnerability interacts with the housing market to produce lots of homelessness. That's the thesis. So, as I mentioned before, I'm much more interested in the left side of this graphic, which is kind of people exiting or leaving or being pushed out of the housing market because there's inadequate housing for them, and they enter the crisis response system. It's that flow into homelessness. There's another thread of research, which is, if you've been following the debate about housing first right now, which it's hard to avoid it. It's in the New York Times all the time. It's probably in your newspaper. Okay. That's really about how do we get people out of homelessness once they're experiencing it, which is an important conversation and one that I'm involved in. But this book is really much more about the left-hand side, the flow into. And what's really frustrating about this is the inadequate supply of housing pushes people into homelessness, and it also makes it a lot harder for people to exit out on the right side. Because now you're exiting into a housing market where there isn't adequate housing. And so it pushes people in, and it serves as a lid to that system of exiting. And that's why that crisis response system just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The prime example of this is New York City. Because of litigation, they created a right to shelter. And what has happened? They have built a massive shelter system. There are 100,000 people who sleep every night in the New York shelter system. Why is it so big? Because they can't get out. People keep flowing in, and there's very limited exits because there isn't housing. And so when elected leaders in Seattle and Portland and LA say, Greg, should we build more shelter? I'll say, yeah, probably. But if that's our solution, we don't want New York 2.0, because that's basically then just warehousing people in the crisis response system. And if you haven't been in a homeless shelter, it's not a real pleasant place. People spend years and years and years in the New York shelter system. Kids are raised in the New York shelter system. And so we need to have a healthy conversation of what's the appropriate crisis response while also acknowledging the fact that we have got to reduce the flow into homelessness. And the way we do that is to create more housing that's more affordable for more folks. No matter how angry people get with me, I'm not giving up on that point. I think it's right. Okay, we good? All right. So I'm going to start here with, and this is going to be small for you, but I'll tell you kind of what you're looking at. This is basically, so the data in the book ended in 2019. It came out in 2022. Obviously, the world has continued in the last 5 years, and so what I've done is updated the data from the book. So this is not identical to what's in the book, but generally speaking, the message is the exact same. One of the problems here is that Multnomah County has now jumped to the top of the county list, okay? Which is not a company that you want to be keeping. But here's the complication on per capita rates of homelessness. This is bureaucratic BS, but it's important for you to understand. Some people count homelessness at the city level, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., New York City. Okay. Other places like Multnomah County and King County, my county up in Seattle, count at the county level. Neither one is right or wrong. All else equal, places that count at the city level should have higher per capita rates of homelessness because homelessness congregates in the urban core. Okay. Counties are including suburban locations where there is, where it's just less prevalent. So what we can't do is compare King County or Multnomah County to New York City. That's an apples to oranges comparison. We need to compare within cities and within counties. So when you look at cities, what you'll see is, oh, this is really small on my screen. New York, San Francisco, Boston, and DC are really high, and Chicago and Indianapolis are pretty low. At least as of 2019, it was like a 5-to-1 relationship. We then go to counties and conduct the same analysis, and at the time of the writing of the book, it was again about a 5-to-1 relationship, which I didn't realize until I'd actually run the numbers. You now have jumped ahead, Multnomah. You were kind of 3rd or 4th before. But what you'll see is, again, massive variation. So what we're going to do in the book is just use real simple statistics and try to answer this question. Why is it so bad in some places and not others? Okay. So one element of this book is to really bust myths about homelessness. What motivated me was, frankly, a lot of conversations I had in my social circle where people would spout off about homelessness. Okay. My best friend has a PhD in physics, and when he goes to a party and people find out that he has a PhD in physics, people just go, wow. When I go to a party and say that I study housing, my wife rolls her eyes because she knows exactly what's coming, and someone says, Greg wrote a book about homelessness, and then people come up and lecture me about homelessness. It happens every single time. Because we all have some experience with housing, we are to a certain extent an expert, and we're willing to share our opinions. And no one would ever say, like, you're wrong about physics to Josh, but people tell me all the time, like, you're wrong. I'm like, how do you know? Have you studied this? Well, I saw Joe on the street. I'm like, well, okay. That's what we're going with? Okay. So this is kind of responding to those critiques. So we're going to use these real simple statistical relationships. We call them bivariate relationships, 2 variables. See what is the statistical relationship and see if it helps to explain regional variation. Okay? So this, you're going to see a few of these. I'm going to explain what you're looking at. The bottom axis here is poverty. Of course, homelessness is a poverty problem. At its fundamental nature, homelessness is a poverty problem. Okay? So what we're going to do is look at the relationship in a community's poverty rate to rates of homelessness. Okay? And what we find when we do that is there's actually a negative relationship, meaning places with really high rates of poverty have low rates of homelessness, which is a total head scratcher because I just told you that poverty causes homelessness. It does at the individual level. At a community level, homelessness thrives amidst affluence, which is why homelessness is worse in our nation's richest cities. Boston and Seattle are the 2 richest cities in the United States, and San Francisco, those 3. And they have the most homelessness. Our poorest cities, I spoke in Flint, Michigan this fall. I said when I got back to Seattle, you could not find 2 more different cities than Flint and Seattle. Flint has been in a 50-year downward spiral. It is sad, sad, sad. And they have 1/5 the homelessness of Seattle. It's no picnic being in Flint. They've had a lot of challenges. Homelessness isn't one of them. Why? Because there's abundant housing. Frankly, a bunch of housing's boarded up. Okay? So we don't see homelessness in really poor places like Detroit and Flint and Cleveland and St. Louis, but we see it in really rich places. So the point here is not that poverty doesn't matter. The point is that being poor in a rich place has really, really big consequences. It's no picnic in Detroit, but it's a real big problem in San Francisco. Right? If you're poor and you need to get to $700 a month in rent in Detroit, you might be able to figure it out through low-wage labor, public assistance, familial support. If you got to get to $2,200 in San Francisco, no shot. Okay. So we can't blame poverty for regional variation in rates of homelessness. All right, so now we're going to get into mental illness. This is when people's blood pressure starts to rise. I always make this joke because people will come after me after talks. I'm just like, just settle down. Okay. People don't like this. So I've split this up pre-2020 and post-2020 because the federal agency that collects these data changed their methodology, and so the numbers are different. You can't compare pre and post. But the point here is that the line is pretty flat in both of them, meaning there are people experiencing serious mental illness at varying rates throughout the United States, and that variation bears no relationship to rates of homelessness. Okay. And the drug and mental illness data are better at the state level, so this is state level analysis, but it's the same logic. There are people, of course, experiencing mental illness in Washington, Oregon, and California, but it's not disproportionate to Kansas and Arkansas and Louisiana. Okay. So we can't blame the problem in our West Coast states on disproportionate rates of mental illness. Now, is mental illness combined with a bad housing market a real problem? Absolutely. Does it complicate matters for people who are vulnerable in these states? For sure. But it's not just that we have more mentally ill people. We might see more mentally ill people because they're not housed, but we don't have more. This is substance use disorders. This is when people start to get really, really irritated, because this is inconsistent with what they see on the streets of Portland and Seattle and San Francisco and Los Angeles. Greg, how dare you suggest this isn't a drug problem? My response when people attack me on this is, do you think people use drugs in Chicago? They do. And what's the biggest drug problem? What is the biggest drug crisis in the United States over the last 20 years? West Virginia, the opioid epidemic. Right? Highest overdose death rates in the United States are West Virginia, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana. Okay? Do we hear people talking about the homelessness crisis in those states? No. That crisis is a tragedy, tons of lost lives, et cetera, et cetera. We know that story. But we don't have a homelessness crisis. If drugs use and abuse were fundamentally the driver of this crisis, we should see massive rates of homelessness in those states, and we don't. Again, this isn't to minimize these crises. What it is to say is that the context in which that happens really, really matters. Okay. Another really important point when we talk about homelessness is massive racial disparities. Okay. Black, brown, indigenous people are 3 to 5 times overrepresented in the homeless population. Okay. And there are many reasons that many of us know why that is. We have 400-year legacy of racism in this country, in education, in criminal justice, in housing, in healthcare, right? And that manifests itself then in this highly vulnerable population that is disproportionately composed of people of color. Okay? So does race or racial identity explain regional variation? The answer to that question is no. Right? Chicago has a higher black population than Seattle does, yet has far lower rates of homelessness. But black people are overrepresented in the homeless population in both Seattle and Chicago. So what's going on here? The way I explain this slide is that racial composition doesn't explain homelessness. Being black doesn't explain homelessness. Racism explains homelessness. Racism determines who within a given community is going to experience homelessness, which is why black, brown, indigenous people are overrepresented in each community in the United States. So it explains who experiences homelessness. It doesn't explain the Seattle-Chicago difference, if that makes sense. Okay? So the point being that all these individual factors, none of these have provided a good explanation. We're still looking for a good explanation, right? So we're just crossing these off. So now we're going to go to the local context. I included this chapter in the book because of the cocktail party conversations I would have. Greg, it's the weather on the West Coast. Has anyone ever heard this? Yeah. I would much rather be homeless in LA than Chicago. Well, point 1, I don't want to be homeless anywhere. Point 2, maybe. But let's take a look. We count homelessness in January. Let's look at January weather and the relationship to homelessness. And what we see is, at least if you look at it linearly, there's no relationship at all. There might be some omega relationship here. But the point being that we have warm places like Florida, Texas, and Arizona that don't have a lot of homelessness. And we have cold places like New York and Boston that have a ton of homelessness. So the Chicago-LA thing makes sense for people, but then you zoom out, it's like, well, it's not happening in Arizona and Texas and Florida. They're plenty warm in January, right? So we'd love to blame Mother Nature, and I think the reason that we are so tempted by that is then we don't have to blame ourselves. We'd love to blame an outside force. We can't in this case. Mother Nature is not at fault. Greg, if we weren't so generous, people would stop moving here to experience homelessness. Has anyone heard this? I first heard this argument actually in Minneapolis. When I was getting my PhD, and people were blaming folks from Chicago for homelessness in St. Paul and Minneapolis. And I actually did some work on that when I was in grad school and found almost no evidence of it. But you'd ask people, even in the Health and Human Services Department who were responsible, I'm like, well, where are these people coming from? Chicago, they're coming from Chicago. I'm like, okay, interesting. In my first meeting in Seattle, I'm sitting there listening, I'm the new guy, I'm not saying anything, and someone said, you know, we got a problem with homelessness in Seattle because everyone's moving here. And I'm like, well, from where? And they said, California. I was like, okay, well, that's what Minneapolis said. And then I go to meetings in California, what do they say? We're a magnet for homelessness. I'm like, well, where are your people coming from? You can't, you're sending your people to Seattle, I just heard. And then, of course, California says Texas. We love to blame Texas for things. Middletown, Ohio, we read about Middletown, Ohio in the book. They believe they're a magnet for homelessness because they're incredible generosity. And with all due respect to the lovely people of Middletown, I don't buy it for a second. Okay? And so this magnet theory is so prevalent, yet there's very little empirical support for it. My friend Margot Kuchel, we are writing a book right now. She's at University of California, San Francisco. She did a massive study of homelessness in California, interviewed thousands of people. What did they find? 90% of the people experiencing homelessness in California are from California. Did some people move there? Sure. And we can wring our hands and worry about that 10%, or we can basically look in the mirror and acknowledge the fact that this is a homegrown problem. We could build a massive wall around California and homelessness isn't going away. And when you look at mobility, which is a really interesting area of study, what you'll see is there's an explanation for why this is not a mobility story. When you look at residential mobility by income, what you'll see is when you look at local moves, residential mobility is really high for low-income folks because they tend to be renters and leases are a year and you see a lot of cycling in the residential market. When you look at state-to-state moves or longer-term moves, residential mobility falls with income. Why? Because moving is hard. It's disruptive, you need resources, you're leaving social networks, et cetera. And so what I talk about is we moved a family of 4 from Minneapolis to Seattle in 2017. We had 2 middle school kids. It sucked. It really did. And we had every advantage under the sun. We had resources, we had people who loved and cared for us. I had a job to come to, but still we had to find schools for the kids, we had to find a house, we didn't have any friends. It was hard. Now imagine you're at the end of the rope and someone says, Greg, why don't they just leave? It's really expensive in Seattle. I'm like, why do they have to leave? This is their home. We priced them out of Seattle, and now we're saying, why don't you just leave? If your mom or dad is the only one who can care for your kids when you go to work, are you going to move to Topeka, Kansas because it's cheaper? Or Cedar Rapids, Iowa because their welfare benefits are more generous? Right? It just doesn't make sense, yet we continue to make this argument. This chart looks at TANF, which is the primary federal welfare program, typically for women and children. Huge state-to-state variation. We have generous states, stingy states. What we see is people are not congregating in generous states who are experiencing homelessness. People are not sitting in LA saying, look at the TANF benefits in Minnesota. I'm going to move across the country, disrupt my life for an extra $125 a month, right? And when I say generous, it's in quotations. If you've ever looked at welfare benefits from the federal government, they are anything but generous, okay? So this mobility argument, again, just doesn't hold up a lot. So, what does? Well, we told you on the cover of the book. Okay. One of the scary things about writing a book is people can write book reviews. And they can say whatever the hell they want to say. So every time a book review pops into my inbox, still 4 years in, my heart starts to beat a little bit because you're just waiting for someone to just trash you. My favorite one was written by this fellow who's a professor at Indiana University. And after it came out, I sent him an email and I said, you win the award for best opening sentence to a book review. Gregg Colburn and Clayton Aldern would make lousy mystery writers because we tell you on the front of the book what the story is. This is a housing problem. Okay? This is the money slide. No one's giving us a Nobel Prize for this. Where rents are high, homelessness is high. Dun, dun, dun. Okay? This makes intuitive sense. And this is far more convincing, statistically speaking, than any other nonsense I hear on Saturday night at a cocktail party while I'm drinking my red wine, nodding and smiling. Greg, it's people moving here. Well, have you looked at this R squared compared to your R squared? Okay. This is rental market vacancy rate. This is the one variable that changed since 2020, so I'm going to bifurcate that a little bit. But generally speaking, if you put these two things together, and vacancy rates drive rents, so they're related, they're not independent variables. But what I say to folks is if you don't buy this, tell me a place in the United States that has really high rents and low vacancies that doesn't have a problem with homelessness. And then when I pose that question to people, they'll just kind of like look at the ceiling, and I was like, I'll save you the time, there isn't one. Okay. We're batting 1,000, which means every single place that has those conditions has a lot of homelessness. Okay. What's interesting, though, is with vacancy rates is we had a lot of housing production coming out of COVID, and we had weird patterns, and so actually the relationship fell apart afterwards because we saw vacancy rates fall in places like Indianapolis and St. Louis, and they actually went up in places like Seattle and San Francisco. So it's the one variable that doesn't hold post. We can talk about this at another lecture. But what we're seeing already in Seattle and San Francisco and probably Portland is the vacancy rates are starting to come down again because we have no new deliveries because interest rates are up and we're not building housing and we're going to be back in the same mess. But generally speaking, the thesis of the book is that high rents and low vacancies are a really big problem. for housing, for all sorts of things, and it's a big driver of homelessness. So one way to kind of think about this, what I wanted to do for our readers is to kind of give them a sense of like, how do we think about this from an economic perspective? And so it's nice to give an economics lecture where I don't have to explain elasticity. I will explain it for those of you who haven't taken economics in a long time. So elasticity, in this case supply elasticity, is a really important notion in the housing market, okay? And so if you took economics at some point and you didn't understand it, we're gonna do a real quick lecture, okay? So imagine clickers as a product that you're producing. If the price of clickers goes up 10 times tonight, and you happen to be manufacturing these clickers, what are you gonna do? The first thing is you're probably gonna pop some champagne because you're gonna say, this is a really good time to be manufacturing clickers, right? And you're gonna produce a bunch of them, right? And you can probably do that pretty quickly. I can go to 2 shifts or 3 shifts, and pretty soon we'd have a pretty elastic response, right? So this is a pretty elastic good, is what economists would say, okay? If the price of housing in Portland goes up 10 times tonight, what happens to the supply of housing in Portland next week? Nothing, zero, nada. There's literally no change. So housing generally is not a terribly elastic good because it takes a long time to build housing. I need land, I need permits, I need financing, I need labor, materials. Okay. And economists have taught us that there's some places that have more elastic housing supply than others. The 2 drivers of supply elasticity for housing are topography. If you have mountains and water, it's harder to build housing. And regulatory environment. There are places where it's easier to build and places where it's harder to build. Okay? San Francisco is the perfect storm for an inelastic housing market. You have topography, which adds to its beauty, and it's incredibly hard to build housing. Years and years and years to get a permit to build housing. And I'm not anti-regulation. There's an important role for regulation in society. But there are people dying in the streets in San Francisco, and we're waiting 2 or 3 years to give a permit for housing. I think that is absolutely ridiculous. Okay? There has to be a reasonable ground around permitting such that we can build something that we desperately need. It is literally a life and death thing. And we're sitting around twiddling our thumbs, arguing about the design review on a house in San Francisco, right? I am outraged by that, okay? I don't frequently find myself advocating for Texas-style policy, but you know what? They build a lot of housing in Texas. And so what this chart shows is the relationship between population growth, which is a proxy for housing demand, and supply elasticity. The higher the number, the more elastic the housing supply. So the upper right quadrant is really interesting to me. In the decade of the 2010s, these were Sunbelt cities that grew just as fast as Seattle and San Francisco and Boston. But they had really high supply elasticity, and they built a ton of housing, generally through sprawl, because their topography allowed for that. And they were able to maintain vacancy rates, which are the numbers in parentheses, at pretty high levels. The rental market vacancy rate that you should be thinking about is 5%. It's like unemployment, you never get to 0, right? Because you leave your job, your seat is empty for a bit, and then someone fills it. Same thing with housing, right? My lease is up, I leave, it's open for a month, so there's always some structural vacancy. 5% is kind of the number that economists have told us is kind of the neutral point. Above 5 would suggest that you have sufficient supply, below 5 would suggest that you have a deficit of rental supply. Okay? And so what you'll see is in Charlotte and San Antonio and Austin and Dallas, they had a huge population growth, they built a bunch of housing, and they maintained a much more reasonable housing market. The bottom right quadrant, in which Seattle finds itself, is the perfect storm for a housing and homelessness crisis. A whole bunch of people move there, pay them a bunch of money, and then you don't build a bunch of housing. I describe this as tragic, but 100% predictable. And shame on Seattle, because we watched San Francisco go through their tech boom 10 or 15 years ahead of us, and we didn't learn, and now we're in the same mess. Okay. And so this is not complicated, but yet we are really reluctant to embrace these explanations because we still see Joe on the street. And that is a more powerful emotional response than Gregg talking about supply elasticity. Snooze, right? Fear is a powerful motivator. That's fearful. That doesn't move me. So that's kind of, what we present in the book. And so, as I say, what has the data told us since we published the book? Basically, the logic of the book holds, which is bad news if you care about human beings in society. And unfortunately, it's holding in more places. We see places like Phoenix and Denver, Austin, starting to exhibit traits that look a lot like coastal cities. Population growth, shrinking vacancy rates, and a lot more homelessness. And then our problem children on the coast are still there. What's the response been? I didn't think anyone would read it. People read it. Generally speaking, the response has been overwhelmingly positive. Got a lot of great feedback. I've been able to talk at really cool places, and so that's been a lot of fun. What's been really rewarding is people who come up to me after talk saying, I was really skeptical coming in here, Greg. I didn't even want to come, and you changed my mind on this, right? That's a really rewarding thing to hear. There are also some people who are really, really, really irritated. I was on sabbatical last fall, so I wasn't on campus very much. I came in to check my mailbox one day, and someone had cut the cover off our book. Postmark was Boise, Idaho, and offered an alternative title for the book. Homelessness is a 75% mental health addiction problem. And then wrote, Greg, take off your woke goggles to solve the problem. Okay? And this is one of many, many, many messages, and this one I can share because it's not R-rated. Okay? People are really, really agitated and triggered by this topic, and that has been a huge shock to me. So we have this problem. It's getting worse in a lot of places. How are we responding at a federal, state, and local level? This is where things start to get complicated. 2 years ago, right here in Oregon, the Grants Pass case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, which was basically a case about whether we can criminalize people sleeping on public land. And the Supreme Court, in their wisdom, determined the answer to that question is yes, which means that if it is now law of the land at the federal level, that if you are sleeping on public land, you can be cited. And I listened to all 2 hours of this debate. It is tragic, but it's also really interesting, and there were literally justices arguing about whether sleeping is a basic human function and whether you can criminalize a basic human function. It was really something else. And so that then gave a green light to jurisdictions to say we can now have a more robust response. And this is not just a red state, blue state thing. The day after the Grants Pass ruling, Gavin Newsom put on his blue jeans and was at a site clearing encampments and throwing people's belongings into a dumpster. Okay? So this is pretty significant. We've certainly seen with the new presidential administration a much stronger and more robust and harsher response to homelessness. We saw that clearly in Washington, D.C. We've also seen huge action at the state level, especially in red states, where there is an advocacy organization, they're a think tank, that is pushing boilerplate anti-camping criminalization legislation in state after state after state. I have a Google alert for my name and the name of the book because it's been kind of interesting to see how it's used. Every day I get an alert. Someone is saying homelessness is a housing problem. Kind of interesting, usually in good ways. This one popped up a year or two ago, and this is from Oklahoma. And this journalist, who I don't know, apparently had read our book, and she was interviewing the author in the Oklahoma State Legislature of this criminalization bill. And so she's interviewing him and says, Representative Weaver, do you feel like homelessness is a housing problem? And he said, well, it could be. I mean, it could be if they don't have a place to live. Okay? So the author of this criminalization bill, when pressed, has to acknowledge that, yeah, there's kind of a housing part of the story. I sent this to Margot at UCSF, and she said, we need to make t-shirts of that. If you've been following this narrative, there's a huge debate about housing first right now. This actually came out on Christmas morning. I'm quoted in this piece. He didn't tell me that it was going to come out on Christmas morning. And because we're on the West Coast, I woke up Christmas morning. We celebrate Christmas in our household. And I got up and grabbed my phone, and the kids are in college, so it's not like we're running down at 6 in the morning. And I had all these text messages. And I was like, oh, it's so nice. So many people wishing me Merry Christmas. And it's from largely my Jewish and Indian friends. I'm like, wow, that's so nice of them. Well, they're all on the East Coast reading the New York Times because they're not celebrating Christmas. And they're all like, whoa, Greg, this is crazy. And basically what the New York Times said is, let's put a microscope on housing first. And so I and some other people were saying, this is what the evidence says about this, and then the other side was saying that it hasn't worked. If you walk around Portland and Seattle, it's evidence that housing first doesn't work. I think that's just a really bad interpretation of the failure to scale a policy response that actually has really good evidence behind it. The failure is not housing first, the failure is a lack to scale it. But because we haven't done that, we've invited a counter-argument. And what was frustrating about this piece in the New York Times, and I like this journalist, but I have a bone to pick with him, is we put housing first under a microscope. And is it perfect? No. If someone's been on the street for 6 years and they've experienced the trauma of homelessness, you think it's going to be fine in a week? No. We need to help people far more quickly. Far more quickly. And so what they did was subjected Housing First to this very rigorous examination, and then basically let the other side say we should have treatment first, which what that means is you got to sober up before you get into housing. We're going to force treatment on you. And what's interesting is what they didn't talk in the article is about why we went to Housing First in the first place. We had a treatment first approach for a long time in the 1980s. It wasn't very successful, and then this guy, Sam Zimberis, created the Housing First model in New York City. And they started to do studies on it, and what they found was, is it perfect? No, but it actually works pretty well. That once you fulfill people's basic needs, they can start to do treatment and start to get themselves better. And so what administration in the United States enshrined Housing First as their federal policy on homelessness? It was the radical socialist George W. Bush. Okay? And the Bush administration, to their credit, looked at the evidence and said, this is better than that, so we're going to go with that. And so since that time, Bush and then Obama and on, even Trump 1, said that this is our policy. And is it perfect? No, but it's better than the alternative. And now what we've done is thrown that out, and we're going to go back to the 1980s for an intervention that has almost no evidence behind it. And that didn't show up in this New York Times piece, which was why I was really irritated on Christmas morning. What we're seeing is very, very harsh responses. This is a chilling article that if you have not seen it in the New York Times, I highly recommend it. They are building a massive camp outside of Salt Lake City to round people up and put them in. And what I've said is we have a very poor history as a species of building camps and rounding people up and putting them in. Okay? And that's what we're doing. And it's being driven by people just saying, I'm sick and tired of seeing folks on the streets, so let's round them up and away we go. This is a very, very dangerous path that we're on. And I lose sleep thinking about the folks who are on the streets who are going to be subjected to this. Right? And we collectively are going to allow it because it's uncomfortable for those of us who live stable, comfortable lives. I'd rather not see it. One way that you're not going to see it is we round people up and put them in a camp on the outskirts of town. So where do we see progress and success? Is this all doom and gloom? No, it's not. We see a lot of success. The best success that we have, and when I was in DC meeting with the HUD secretary and she asked about homelessness, I said, if I were in your position, I would be standing on the tallest mountaintop screaming about the success we've had with veteran homelessness. Okay. My dad's generation, the Vietnam generation, came back from the war. It was typically men at that time, and they were grossly overrepresented in the homeless population. Lots of PTSD that was untreated, and we viewed this as kind of a stain on the country. We didn't feel good about how we dealt with that generation. And so now we have a new generation of soldiers who are in Iraq and Afghanistan coming back with similar problems. And leaders of both political parties, in their wisdom, said, let's not repeat the mistakes we made with the Vietnam generation. Fantastic. Republicans and Democrats said, how about let's make sure that we get housing and services to people who need it. We provided the funding, we provide the mechanism through the VA system and HUD, and what do? We cut veteran homelessness by 55% in just over a decade. It is a massive success that people don't understand, and that's why I said to the HUD secretary, I was like, I would say that every single time you have the opportunity to do so. What this demonstrates is that when you have political will and resources and scalable solutions, we can have success. The reason we're not having success right now is because we didn't have that. Why did we do it for veterans? It's good politics. And I'm all for housing veterans. My dad's a veteran, grandpa's a veteran. It's fantastic. I'm also for housing people who weren't veterans. But we drew the line there. That's why we had success with veterans and not with the rest of the population. And so when people say housing first doesn't work, I say, BS, look at this. That's what we did. We gave people housing and services. Some people just need a housing voucher. They just need purchasing power. Other people have really complex needs, and we're providing services. And it worked. We've seen a lot of local progress. Houston, Chattanooga, Denver, St. Paul, good evidence around. Right? We are not powerless. Is it harder in Seattle and Portland than it is in Chattanooga? Yeah, it is. We have a much more challenging housing market. Houston had great success, but they also had 9% vacancies and really low rents. Right? And so it's not to diminish the good work that they've done, but it's a greater degree of difficulty out here because of the housing market that we're in. So given all of this, and given that we've had success, why do we have this kind of huge skepticism that's still out there? This was a political cartoon that was in the Seattle Times at the end of last year, and it might be small for you, but what this says is, Homelessness in King County before billions of tax dollars are spent on the problem, 2015. The bottom image is the identical image, 2025. Homelessness in King County after billions of tax dollars are spent on the problem. This is the issue. Our collective failure to scale solutions has invited this narrative, which is fair. I am all for holding our elected officials accountable for the investments that they make. I think that's just a good practice. We should be good stewards of public funds. And the problem is because our response has been woefully inadequate, the progress we've made is overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. And therefore, people can say, well, we spent $1 billion and it didn't help. What they don't know is the counterfactual that it might have actually been far worse had we not made those investments. So I was giving a talk at UCLA, and LA has been very, very aggressive in their investments. They had a $1.2 billion ballot measure called HHH to deal with homelessness. And I was down there and people were complaining that $1.2 billion hadn't ended homelessness. And I said, well, you have a $50 billion problem, you threw $1 billion at it and it didn't go away. It's not the billion's fault. It probably helped a lot of people, probably saved a lot of lives. The problem is the scale of the problem is grossly, or the response is grossly inadequate to the scale of the problem. That's the issue, and that then invites this type of narrative, which then makes politics and making decisions a lot more difficult when you have such a skeptical public, which is why I'm concerned about this kind of move away, because it's gonna inflame these concerns, which makes this work even harder, and invites solutions like the Salt Lake City solution, which is, well, let's just round them up. I've had people in my social circle say, Greg, why don't we just round them up and send them to Wenatchee, which is just on the other side of the mountains in Washington? And I was like, what are you talking about? What have they done to deserve getting rounded up, and what did Wenatchee deserve to get, like, why does Wenatchee want this? Right? And these are people who would describe themselves as progressive and people of goodwill, right? We are losing this public narrative in a major way. So when we think about the housing market, what's going on in the housing market, what we're seeing around the country, frankly, is pretty alarming. I've had a chance to meet Sean Donovan a couple times, who was Obama's HUD secretary. He ran housing in New York City before he went to the federal government. He knows housing probably better than anyone in the country. And he has said on multiple occasions, this is the worst housing situation he's seen in his lifetime. And so when Sean Donovan says that, I listen. It's very, very alarming. What we're seeing is, especially in the Midwest, really tight markets. Indianapolis and Cedar Rapids, and what we're seeing is vacancy rates going down, rents going up, and they're saying, we can't get people housed anymore. Frontline service workers are saying, boy, 5 years ago, we could get someone, we get a little assistance, we get them housed, we can't do it anymore. We actually have seen corporate actors going in and buying up housing in the Midwest because the latest wager that the region's lack of supply provides fertile ground for rent hikes. They're telling you exactly what they're gonna do. The fact that we haven't built enough housing in those communities is basically a green light for rent hikes. And it's not illegal what they're doing. What they see is a market opportunity, and shame on us for creating that market opportunity. Had we built sufficient housing, there wouldn't be kind of just dollars laying on the ground that they can take. And I used to be in this business, right? So I understand the idea of allocating capital. The problem is with this, is they're gonna make a lot of money, and if you're on the margins in those cities, it's gonna be increasingly difficult for you to survive and remain stably housed. We actually had a pretty big boom in multifamily housing across the United States coming out of COVID. We had really low interest rates coming into COVID, relatively low prices. We built a ton of housing, and that is coming online now. And so we've seen in Portland and Seattle and San Francisco more deliveries, higher vacancy rates, which is good. Rent growth kind of stabilized. And unfortunately now with the increase in interest rates, what we're seeing is permitting activity has taken a nosedive. And so what I've said in the mayor's office when I've been at City Hall, which I spend more time at City Hall than I would like, getting in the middle of all these fights, I said I'm way more concerned about low vacancies than high vacancies in 3 years. And I think that's true all around, and I really fear that we're gonna see this kind of acceleration of rents in a lot of communities around the United States. So what's going on here? You have an interesting dynamic in Portland is one of the more unique cities in the United States. I'm just gonna say that up front. It does not fit neatly into any of these narratives. Portland had a really tight housing market in the 2010s, which led to increasing rents, but you've actually had a pretty nice increase in rental market vacancy rates. You're up to about 6% now, which isn't terribly high, but it's high enough that you're not gonna see these kind of double-digit rent increases. So that's good. But you just see kind of rents still humming along. You're up over $1,600 now, and this is from the US Census, which is expensive, but it's not Seattle and San Francisco. That's Multnomah, this is Portland, it's basically the same chart. As I said, Portland is very unique. Among places with lots of homelessness, you are by far the cheapest, you have way more poverty, relatively speaking, and you have much higher substance use than other cities. So when people say, Gregg, explain Portland for me, I was like, I can't exactly. But I think what you have is you have some of the dynamics of other communities without the robust economic growth, but you still have kind of West Coast housing costs, which is kind of a perfect storm for problems, which I think is kind of what's going on. But it is a really unique place. You do not have the wealth that Seattle has. When you look at incomes in Seattle, they're remarkably high. $20 minimum wage in Seattle, right? I mean, there's just a lot of people making decent money. Wages are just lower here. Your rents are lower, but not sufficient to make up for that. And so it's a very unique place that doesn't fit quite as neatly as some other places, which is complicated. It's a complicated place. All right, so what do we do with all of this? What do we do with all this? I guess the one other point I want to make on kind of the substance use thing, and this is certainly true in Portland, is the literature on substance use disorders and behavioral health challenges is pretty clear that the causal arrow goes in both directions. Okay? What I mean by that is if I'm experiencing addiction or mental illness, that might cause me to experience homelessness. Very possible. Almost as likely is the fact that you leave me on the streets for 5 years, sleeping outside, exposed to the elements, that I will develop a behavioral health disorder. And that is just a basic human response to being in trauma. The research on homelessness is brutal to read. People who are living outside are exposed to physical and sexual assault at alarming rates. Right? And the trauma associated with this whole experience is, it's no surprise that people medicate. And what I say to folks, and I'm not joking, is that if I were living on the streets in Seattle, I would medicate, and it wouldn't be red wine, which is my traditional medication. Okay? Margot, in her study, asked people, meth is a big drug in California among the homeless population. She asked them, why do you use meth? And they said there are 2 reasons. One is it suppresses my appetite, and I can't find food, and going through the day hungry sucks. The second thing it does is it keeps me awake. When I go to sleep, bad things happen. I get victimized, my stuff gets stolen. So we walk by and say, look at this loser meth addict, and that loser meth addict is taking meth for the very reason of I got to get through today, and then tomorrow I got to get through tomorrow, okay? And so what I have said to the folks who were advising the Trump administration when they followed me to the Netherlands when I was giving a talk over there, is I just said, you know, this is the most vulnerable population in the United States, and it would certainly mean a lot to me and to a lot of people if you guys would exercise a little bit of compassion. They need it. To date, we haven't seen that response from them, but I hope we will. So taking all this in, what do we do? What do we do? Generally speaking, a lot of the money that we spend on homelessness in the United States is what I would call an operating investment, which is meaning it's responding to the issue. It is funding the crisis response system, which is life-saving, and we desperately need it. And I say to the people who do this work on the front lines every day, thank you. It is literally life-saving work. But we are kidding ourselves if creating a crisis response system is going to end this problem, because we still have an inflow problem. We cannot get people out of this system fast enough. Okay? We have got to also make upstream investments in housing, what I would call a capital investment to construct housing. We need a lot of market rate housing, we need affordable housing, we need housing for people experiencing homelessness or who are precariously housed. And we've not made those investments, and we're living with the consequences. And those are tough investments because they're longer term in nature. If I'm running for mayor of Seattle and say, well, Gregg told me that we should just build more housing and that'll be ready in 10 years, and in the next 10 years, tough. Right? That's not a good political message. You will not get elected to office. And so what's more palatable? Let's round them up. Let's build shelter. Let's get them off the streets. And so is there a role for shelter? Yes, hopefully humane shelter. But we've got to make these long-term investments as well. And they're expensive, and they're not politically handy because it takes a longer time. And our sustained disinvestment on that front makes this problem growing, and growing. Okay? Which is why it really takes political courage. And so giving this talk in San Francisco and Portland and Seattle is not a whole lot of fun. It's actually kind of fun in Indianapolis. I've been there 3 times now. And I can say, this is what it looks like on the West Coast. This is where you are. You have a tremendous opportunity. We would kill to trade places with you. And you have the opportunity to show political courage right now to say, that's not where we want to go, let's make those investments right now. And they're like, sign me up for that. And I'm like, yes, let's do that. The first time I went to San Francisco, I spoke at the Silicon Valley Foundation. I think I was in Kansas. I was in Wichita, Kansas, getting a talk. And I said, I'm flying to San Francisco tomorrow. And this woman said, what are you going to say in Silicon Valley? I was like, I have no idea. Stanford professors can't afford to live there. How are we going to end homelessness in Silicon Valley? I mean, it's just, the problem is so immense. We've let it get so out of control that it is really kind of disheartening in these expensive places. And when we start to talk about housing and constructing more housing, then we get into the political challenges of changing land use and multifamily housing and single-family neighborhoods and people's NIMBYism and da-da-da-da-da-da. So this is not easy. It is not easy. This long-term, short-term thing that I was talking about with the mayor, that's a big problem. There's also a big problem of whose responsibility is this? Is this a problem of the private sector, public sector? Okay. I get accused of being both a socialist and a shill for corporate interest in the same talk. Okay? Greg, you're in the pocket of developers because you say it should be easier, cheaper, and faster to build housing. Yes, I believe that. And will people make money in that process? Yes, they will. I also firmly believe that there's a role for the government, ideally the federal government, for providing housing or supports to low-income folks so that they can access housing. You're a socialist. Like, well, one, you don't understand socialism, first of all. Okay? And so, equal opportunity irritation. The point is like, and we're at UW, we're a big rowing school, we need to be in the same boat rowing together. That means we need to have developers. You need to make it easier for them to build housing such that it's cheaper. We need to have public sector willing to make the investments that we need to make sure that people can have housing. We're all in this together. So my hope with this book was that we would take some attention off of Joe on the street, which is why we didn't have a picture of Joe on the cover of this book. Okay. It's too easy to walk by Joe and say, boy, you know, I feel bad for Joe, but Joe made some poor decisions and it allows me to go about my life feeling pretty good about myself. Right? It absolves me of responsibility. If instead I see Joe's consequences as a consequence of structures that I, Gregg Colburn, have contributed to throughout my lifetime, it implicates me. And then at night when I'm brushing my teeth looking in the mirror, I'll say, well, then what am I going to do? What are we going to do? What is our society going to do? And that's uncomfortable. It's a lot easier to blame Joe, right? And what's scary about structural problems is they require structural solutions. Why don't we have structural solutions? Because they're politically challenging, they're expensive, da-da-da-da-da. Let's just blame Joe. Let's round him up. But as I said, the great thing about this is that we are not walking around in the wilderness with a blindfold on. The path is right in front of us. We have abundant evidence. We could fill this room with it, demonstrating that when we prioritize housing and investments, we can end and radically reduce homelessness. Back to the veteran story. Okay? It's right there in front of us. We just have to make a different decision. My fear is that we won't, and this will continue to get worse and worse. And I've said this every year since the book came out. I'm really worried that in 10 years we're going to look back and say 23, 24, 25, 26 was the glory days. It's no picnic right now, and it could get a lot worse. So my hope and my plea for your community and mine is that we make different decisions, because the decisions we're making right now are not working. Thanks so much for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Hello? Okay. Is it on? Hi, thank you for the talk. I found it really illuminating, and I think that for me, what really stuck out was the time that was spent kind of sifting through how like the myths around housing really stop us from getting at the heart of the problem. But I think I still, I'm kind of having a bit of like discontent with this idea of like what feels like there's a bit of a gridlock surrounding media narratives, right? And the idea that like the cities that are more so towards the sun belts are kind of still invested in this idea of like a infestation of fentanyl and all of these things in the by coastal cities in the Pacific Northwest, and then but the fact that they are really adequately dealing with the housing crisis. So I think my question is how to get past like a media gridlock when it comes to harmful narratives surrounding the housing crisis. Would it just be like putting all the energy into like everything is a technocratic issue and the issues with Amazon and such and such? Yeah.
Yeah, so how to get over the media gridlock? If I had a good answer for that, I think I could make a lot of money right now. So we have a media problem in the United States, and it's not just around homelessness. That is complicating all sorts of social issues, every issue. And so I won't begin to pretend to be able to give you a good answer. My response to this question when I get it is, I am one person kind of making this claim, and this argument resonates with some people and it doesn't for others. And I believe that for people who believe in this argument, what we need to be doing is hitting people in every mode of communication possible. And that might be over coffee. It might be through personal stories about an individual who lost their housing. It might be about bivariate statistical relationships in a presentation. And none of those alone is sufficient. We just have to keep going. The narrative on the other side is more compelling. So there's a book called San Francisco, which is pretty famous. It came out right before ours did. A bunch of people have wanted us to do a public debate, and which I've said no to. But if you go to Amazon, and our book has sold pretty well, the number of people who reviewed that book versus our book, it's like 20 times them. So they're winning. There are more people reading that book than our book. And there are more people watching Seattle is Dying, which was a documentary that basically just showed people on drugs laying on the street. Went national. And so there's been, both at the National Alliance to End Homelessness and other places that I go, kind of a reckoning of like, we have failed from a messaging standpoint. And so I think that's, when I talk about research, so I'm on the National Alliance to End Homelessness Research Council, and everyone's talking about all the studies they want to do, and I was like, we need to do studies on how to change people's minds. We don't need another study on the efficacy of Housing First to reduce addiction among youth 18 to 24. Is that good work? Yes, but we need to, we're like doing this stuff, and then we're winning this small battle and losing the war in a major way. And so I really think we have to kind of rethink what research is. And if we want to change the way people think about this, we need to change the type of research we're doing, which is why I wrote the book the way I did. And I told the students this afternoon that I wrote this book with my parents in mind, who both went to the same one. They met in college, small liberal arts college. They don't have PhDs. They don't study fancy statistics. My mom's a special ed school teacher, and my dad was a banker. I wanted them to be able to pick up this book and understand it, partly because of what you're talking about, which is I didn't want to write a journal article that only Anya would read. I'm happy to write articles for Anya, but that to me was not the goal. And so I would give us kind of a C- on this side of the equation in terms of messaging. We're losing. And we see that when we read the New York Times and the Seattle Times and whatever the Portland newspaper is called. Yep. Thank you.
Sorry, Damian. Did you have a question?
I'm wondering, there's been a lot of conversation about how short-term rental markets like Airbnb and VRBO remove a lot of the housing that is being built from long-term rental possibilities. So you have, places where people want a vacation, people can make more money, whether it's a property management company or an individual owner, by renting it out a week at a time as opposed to a year at a time. So did you all incorporate any of this into kind of like the comparisons you were making, or I guess what are you looking at, if at all, in terms of how to ensure that housing stock that will be built will be available to improve access to affordable housing?
Yep, great question. So the short-term rental question is one that I get almost every place I visit. which is good, because I think it's important for people to be aware of this. So we did not incorporate that. It's actually interesting. I've tried to figure out short-term rentals in the US Census data. It's impossible. It's not flagged. And so there have been a few scholars who've done some work on this, which is pretty interesting. My general answer to this question is, it is either a small problem or a really big problem. It depends on where you are. If you're in Aspen, Colorado, this is a massive problem. If you're in Bend, Oregon, this is a massive problem. If you're in New York City, Seattle could outlaw Airbnb tomorrow and we'd still have a housing crisis, right? On the margins, is it helping? No. But to me, that would be probably item 42 on my list of concerns in Seattle. In Sun Valley, it's probably item 1, 2, or 3. So I think it's really kind of dependent on the jurisdiction. And there are some interesting policies that can be imposed. One, you can just outlaw it. Two, you can have different types of taxes, et cetera, et cetera. And so the same thing is true with vacation homes in those communities. And so when I was in Sun Valley, which is the home of billionaires, giving a talk in their library, which is privately funded, it's the nicest library you have ever seen in your life. And what I just said is, I would tax the hell out of these second homes. They're billionaires. Charge them $1 million a year, they'll pay it. So the point is like, we probably won't stop billionaires from buying second homes, but we can generate more revenue off it than just their property taxes. And I think the same thing true with Airbnb. Depending on the situation, it might be banning to in other places. Like maybe it's not that big a deal. What frustrates me about the narrative is it gives elected leaders in places like Seattle an out, and they can say, well, if it wasn't for Airbnb, I'm like, not so fast. We had a big problem before Airbnb, and we still have a big problem, and you don't get to use that as an excuse. We need to look in the mirror and say we have structurally underinvested in housing for 20 years, and that's why we have a problem. It's not just Johnny-come-lately's problem. I'm not advocating for Airbnb, but I just think it's a convenient excuse sometimes, especially in big cities.
Hello, thank you for your talk. And one question I have is, how applicable do you think your solutions are to not only other countries, but also like developing countries as well?
Yeah, so the international comparisons are pretty interesting, and I don't think this applies real well internationally. And so I've been at the European Homelessness Conference a couple times, and what's interesting is homelessness in Europe manifests itself very differently. So in Scandinavia, there's homelessness, but it's really small. It's a small percentage of people, and the people who fall into homelessness have huge behavioral health challenges. In essence, Scandinavia has a safety net, housing supports, income supports, et cetera, and a few people slip through the cracks. And those people have huge issues. And so the research in Scandinavia on homelessness is all about addiction and mental illness and like really challenging issues. And then I show up and I'm talking about the housing market, and they're like, what? It's not relevant there, because if you're serving coffee in Oslo, you're not sleeping in your car and showering at the YMCA, which is what's happening in San Francisco and Seattle right now. And so that to me is a system where like we are always going to have people with really big challenges, and as a society, we can help them. In Norway, it's a pretty small share of the population, and we've got services, and we'll figure it out. The problem with our system, I describe it as the circus act with the plate spinning. There's like all these plates, and they're all spinning, and you're like, one of them's going to fall. That's what our homeless response system is, because we're dealing with really acute folks, like the folks in Oslo who fall through, and we're also dealing with people who are making $20 an hour in Seattle and can't find housing. The homeless response system is trying to fix too many societal issues that all kind of flow down in that funnel to this one issue. And so in places that have what I would consider to be a more equitable and better housing system, the logic of regional variation rates of homelessness because of rents doesn't even make sense. I am doing a paper with folks in Canada. It is relevant in Canada. Vancouver, Toronto, huge rates of homelessness and very, very expensive. And so what we see in Australia, the same thing. I spent some time in Australia. So kind of the Anglo countries that are very kind of market-driven have dynamics similar to us, but as soon as you get outside of kind of these really, really highly commodified systems, the logic doesn't really hold. And as for developing countries, it's a very different dynamic because they just think about housing very differently. One of the problems we have in the United States, and this was well-intentioned, is that we had a lot of people who were kind of white upper middle class people who said this is the standard of housing that everyone should have. And so we have building codes that basically say these are the codes in the United States, and they're very different than what we see internationally. What we didn't do, though, is ensure that people can actually afford that level of housing. So paternalistically, we say, well, of course you should have this kind of housing, but by the way, you're not going to have enough money to afford it, so tough shit. So something's got to give. Either we're going to have different housing typologies in the United States. I actually think we do need different types of housing. I think we're obsessed with high-rise apartments and 2,500 square foot homes. I think we have to have a lot more units that are smaller. My mom was raised in like a 1,200 square foot single-family home in St. Paul, Minnesota. Now no one would buy that house. They raised 3 kids in that house. So we've just gotten accustomed to size. My favorite story on this, my cousin Eric, who lives in Portland, married May Chan. May's parents are Chinese. She was raised in Atlanta. Her dad ran a restaurant in Atlanta, very successful, lived in a big suburban house. Once the kids flew the coop, they moved back and they live in Hong Kong. And they live in like a 200 square foot apartment with a Murphy bed and couldn't be happier. And people say, oh, the Chans, I can't believe you're subjecting yourself. They're like, we love this. In the United States, that would not be deemed quality, acceptable housing. For the Chans, they're having a great time in Hong Kong. And so I really think, and Europe frankly has more of this as well, we have to have a little bit more diversity in terms of our housing. We used to have, and there were no picnics, single room occupancy hotels in big cities like Portland and Seattle and New York, and a lot of people who were precariously housed were living in these places. They weren't ideal, but they had a place to go, and then we converted them to boutique hotels. And now there's no place for them to go. And so I think sometimes our well-intentioned paternalism has exacerbated this problem, and so I think we have to have a better discussion of what housing looks like. Shared housing, co-housing, dormitory style living, shared facilities, that has to be part of the conversation. Because a new housing unit costs $500,000, $700,000 to build in your city and my city. That math doesn't work. There's no way you can build that housing and charge $1,000 a month in rent. There will be no capital going to that. And so we have to think creatively. And I think part of that is different housing typologies, which, especially the global south, and that can be taken to an extreme, but certainly is more comfortable with different housing typologies than we are in the United States.
Thank you for interesting talks. And I'm from Japan. Compared to Japanese construction and permission approval system, U.S. approval and construction approval system is more complicated, I realized. And my question is, historically, why permission and construction approval is more complicated in the U.S.?
So the question was, why is constructing housing more complicated in the U.S. than elsewhere, like in Japan? Is that your question? Well, I think every elected official should try to go through the process of getting housing built. I think it would change the way we look at the world in terms of what it takes to get a permit, what it takes to get land, what it takes to meet code, what it takes to meet all these different things. A lot of this stuff was implemented for good reason. It was well-intentioned, and so I'm not questioning the motivations behind it, but the consequences have had profound consequences. Tokyo is the most affordable big city in the world. Why? They build an absolute ton of housing. It is incredible how much housing they build, and therefore, people assume Tokyo is crazy expensive. It's not. Oslo's expensive, Copenhagen's expensive, New York's expensive, not Tokyo, because they build a ton of housing. And so that, to me, is an incredible model for the world to look at in terms of how do you build a whole bunch of housing pretty fast. And there's some interesting dynamics, and I'm not a scholar of Japanese housing, but I've read papers and listened to talks from people who study that. It's really, really interesting. But it's a lot easier to do it there than here, and so we could learn a lot from our Japanese friends, for sure.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Colburn. This is sort of a continuation off the last 2 questions, but I know in the last couple of years...
Do you mind just putting the mic closer? I'm having a little hard time hearing.
Sure. Yep. California in the last couple of years have passed a few accessory dwelling unit laws, so I wanted to hear your thoughts on that, if that's a step in the right direction. To try to streamline the building process for accessory dwelling units.
ADUs, yeah. Okay, so the question is about accessory dwelling units, which is basically putting a small unit in your backyard, right? California and I think Oregon and certainly Washington have legalized that in some jurisdictions. So I'm a believer that there's not a silver bullet to this. And so when people say, should we do ADUs? I'll say, sure. Yeah, let's do it. I just got an email of the number of ADUs that have been built in Seattle. You know, it's good. It's not changing anything. You know, it's whatever, 15,000 ADUs, which is better than nothing, but in a region that needs 800,000 housing units, ADUs are not gonna fill that. And so I kind of view it as it is one of many tools, and if it's easier to build ADUs, that's better. If we think that ADU legislation is gonna solve our problem, we're fooling ourselves. And it's kind of true for almost every housing policy. There's not one housing lever that we can pull to fix this. And so what I always say is, yes, and, and it's true with tiny homes and homelessness. It's true with ADUs and housing. People just get really locked onto one thing and say, this is the answer. And it's like, no, it's not. It's part of a broader answer. So I'm not trying to rain on the ADU parade. I would just have to be realistic about what it can do and can't do. And so should it be easier and cheaper and faster to build an ADU? Absolutely. And then we still need to do a bunch of other stuff too.
Hi there. Thank you for the talk and the focus on the inflow. My question was, what are some practical levers that government, local, state, county can pull in this existing landscape, even especially given the current local context where tax revenue has decreased, but at the same time, downtown has a lot of empty commercial vacancies. So what are some practical levers that government could pull at this time in Multnomah County or a city like Portland?
So when I think about policy levers, there are levers that you can pull that cost money, and then there are other levers that don't cost money, but they might cost political capital. And so in a time where we have constrained public budgets, you know, just providing rental assistance to everyone who needs it in Multnomah County is probably not going to happen, right? You just don't have the revenue to support that right now. But there are a lot of other things that you can pull that would make it easier, cheaper, and faster to build housing, and that's land use, right? Getting rid of single-family zoning would be a really good thing, and I know you've done some stuff in Oregon on that, which is great. The building code needs to be looked at. We need to be thinking about you know, permitting by right, I think is really important. I think design review, I'm not a designer, I'm not an architect, and they get mad at me for this, but having a neighborhood opining on the design of a building in the middle of a housing crisis is absurd to me. I think it's ridiculous. And so there are a lot of places that have said, here are 6 models that are basically approved immediately if you want to do this. And you can put a different facade on it. Doesn't mean that every house has to look the same, but the point is that you can have basically permit-ready designs that you pull off the shelf and just say, boom, away we go. You get your financing and land and you're off to the races. And so it's that kind of streamlining that ultimately doesn't fix the problem, but it is easier to get more stuff built and hopefully save a little bit of time. I just spent last week in Boston on a tour of modular and panelized housing factories, which to me is the next place that we have to go. I have evolved my thinking on this. I kind of thought naively 4 years ago that we could kind of subsidy our way out of this. I don't think we can, especially in this political environment. We have got to figure out how to make housing way cheaper. And what was crazy and amazing about these facilities is it's basically what Henry Ford did 100 years ago, but we just haven't done it for housing. And there's an amazing economics paper, which maybe you can read, but Ed Glazer, who's a professor at Harvard, and colleagues wrote this paper showing the lack of innovation in construction. We've known this for a long time, but they actually put the numbers to it looking at permits, or excuse me, patents in manufacturing. In construction, nothing. Manufacturing, way up. Tech, way up. Obviously, healthcare and things, tons of patents. So we just haven't innovated. And so that's something that I think local communities can do to say, like, we need to promote innovation in construction such that we can create a lot more housing more quickly. And my favorite story on this is I was giving a talk in Louisville, and they had a panel after I was done, you know, who opined on what I said, and one of the guys there runs a construction company. And the construction company had been founded by his grandfather in the middle part of the last century. His grandpa's been dead for 30 years. And he said, if my grandfather were raised from the dead tonight, I could bring him to the job site tomorrow and put him to work, because we're doing the exact same thing that he was doing in 1960, which is pretty crazy when you think, like, if your grandfather had worked at Ford Motor Company in 1960 and showed up today, he wouldn't even recognize the place because of the innovation and automation. And so all of that lack of innovation has led to housing costs continuing to increase at rates. And so I'm very skeptical that as much as I want the land use reforms and the regulatory reforms, I don't think that's still going to get us to a level where we need to be. And so I think we have to do that plus some innovation, and then hopefully have some help from the federal government on the subsidy side to really have a comprehensive solution here. We cannot keep building the same way. Like, we literally cannot do that.
Hi, I have a friend who couldn't be here tonight because she has a class at 9 p.m. But she is...
Who's the provost there? I want to know.
It's Lewis and Clark College.
9
and
p.m., that's harsh.
it's an art class. But she works frontline on Skid Row in homeless services. And, well, she's incredible and very concerned about the 28 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles.
Yep.
And you said today, earlier when you were meeting with the econ majors, how crisis can be an opportunity. And I am curious about what's going to happen to Skid Row in 2 summers.
I am deeply, deeply, deeply concerned about the World Cup this summer and the Olympics in 28. So Seattle hosted the Major League Baseball All-Star Game 2 summers ago. Our daughter was working for the Mariners that summer, so she was working. And so we went to the game and kind of buzzing around. It was really fun. There was not a person experiencing homelessness within the site. I was at City Hall the Monday after the game, and I said, where in the world did everyone go? And they're like, don't ask. Mayor Harrell was on TV, and they interviewed him and said, where did everyone go? He's like, we didn't do anything. And everyone, the whole city is like, we know you're lying. And Seattle's a pretty compassionate city. The World Cup is coming. If this place isn't pristine, we're going to hear from the president. And so, Portland and Seattle and San Francisco and LA have a massive problem on their hands. They're going to have to clean up the cities, or the feds are going to come in and do it for them. And when the Olympics are in LA, I'm amazed that LA, every time I go to LA, I'm like, I can't believe the Olympics are going to be here. I can't even get a car to go to my hotel. I don't know how they're going to host 250 or 1,000 people a day or whatever it is. There's going to be massive sweeps and rounding people up. And I hope I'm wrong, but I'd put a lot of money on the fact that that's going to happen. And it's going to make it pleasant for people when they come over, and it's going to be really hard for the people who are caught up in this, unfortunately. I hope I'm wrong.
Thanks for the research you're doing. Thanks for bringing this to everybody's attention, and keep up the good fight. My question is, this boils down to basic economics, supply and demand. If there's not enough supply, the price goes up. The more affluence in the city, the price goes even higher. But it's a total disincentive for developers to see the price come down. So how could we incentivize developers to build more? And is this something where the city has to step in and do it themselves? I'm thinking of Vienna, Austria, that did that in the early 1900s, where they have really managed rent because the city's involved in rental, which is forcing the private developers to keep their prices down.
Yep. So the conundrum that you highlight is the central problem of a highly commodified housing market, which is low rents are bad for people who own housing, so there's no incentive to build more housing, and et cetera. And so every time you see rents kind of go down in Seattle, you'll get a story in the Seattle Times of a developer saying, we're calling off all production. It's like, come on. Happens every time. And so it is very hard to just have a private market do this. And so one, as we talked about this afternoon with the students, having more socially owned or publicly owned housing would help a lot. Probably not going to get there anytime soon. And so one of the tools that we can use within the existing framework is, I'm a big believer in carrots to incent the behavior that we want. So Washington has a multifamily tax exemption program, and each jurisdiction can implement that program as they see fit. And so I've studied the MFT program in Seattle. And what it's basically saying is, hey, Mr. and Ms. Developer, we want you to build housing, and if you do, housing that's affordable for someone at 80% of the area median income, we will give you a break on your property taxes. And so basically what they can say is like, well, I'm gonna lose this revenue in rents, but I'm saving this much money on property taxes, and that's a wash, or it's slightly accretive to my deal, and I'll do it. Is it perfect? No. Some people get really frustrated that it's a quote handout to developers, and so I've been kind of navigating some of those challenges in City Hall, but at least we're getting some housing out of it. And so I think there are tools that we can use. There's also the stick approach, which is inclusionary zoning, which is if you build housing in jurisdiction, 10% of those units have to be affordable. Developers hate that because now they're losing out revenue and they're not getting anything in between. So what happens is they raise the rents in the other units to make the math work. And so it's a really hotly contested topic in the academy on housing because generally speaking, I think IZ is nice because you get those units, but the problem is it's not a free lunch. It comes out somewhere else. And so kind of purist kind of economists think it's a terrible policy. And so can you IZ your way out of this? Probably not. Is it, you know, we have MHA, which is inclusionary zoning in Seattle, and MHA layers on top of MFTE, and the developers are really irritated because they're trying to have that affordability and this affordability, and they don't, you know. So it's a real conundrum. And, you know, I think, I told the students this afternoon, I was in the Netherlands this summer, 30%, up until 2 years ago or 3 years ago, 30% of their housing stock was socially owned. It's just a lot easier to deal with this stuff when 30% of your housing stock is not subject to market forces. They have to charge rent, obviously, to keep it up and all that kind of stuff, but it's just a totally different deal than we're at less than 1% publicly owned housing, and then we got vouchers and stuff to 4 or 5%. It's just really tough. And then developers are economic beings. If they can't deliver return to the capital that they raise, the housing's not going to get built. And I do think that the anti-developer vibe in Seattle and Portland is unfortunate. I think people assume it's more lucrative than it is. They do take a fair amount of risk. Do they make money? Sure, they make money. But it's not like there's just tons of margin sitting there that they can just forego. Because we see them, like when you ratchet down MFTE, they just say we're not going to build anymore because no longer the math doesn't work. So it's a big problem. And so then when people say, well, Greg, this is a capitalism problem. Well, to a certain extent it is, right? And capitalism, there are a lot of great things about capitalism. One of them is it's not really great at delivering basic needs to people who don't have money. That's not one of the fine attributes of capitalism. I mean, that's what we're living with here.
Hi, I'm wondering, so I'm from Iceland. Like you said, we don't have a lot of homelessness, but I personally would say that we are in a housing crisis. Like, you can't really buy a place or get into the market on your own or without support. And a lot of, I guess, backlash I receive when I try to point that out to especially older people, and I'm sure a lot of people here face the same, is people that don't believe in the housing crisis and the fact that it's an actual problem. People say that, oh, it's always been hard to get into the market and buying a home is always hard. I guess, like, what is your response to that?
Yeah, I think we have a huge generational challenge here. And Iceland has had some really interesting economic history, you know, coming out of the great financial crisis and kind of a huge boom and bust. And I'm sure that's had big implications on the housing market. I can't speak to Iceland, but I can speak to the United States. What I'm very irritated and frustrated about hearing is people who are my parents' age. My parents are in their late 70s, who bought their first home after my dad got out of the military in the mid-70s. I was like 3 years old. And I don't know what they paid for this house, but it's probably like $75,000, maybe $50,000. And, you know, my dad had a job and they were fine. And, but everyone says, well, my mortgage was 12% because interest rates were really high back then, which is true. They were really high. And now it's 6 or 7% and everyone's complaining. It wasn't a problem for us. And I said, well, the reason why you could afford a 12% mortgage is that it was like 2 times your income, or maybe 3 times your income. And now in many places, we're at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times income. And so when you have the cost of a home relative to income that's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times, a 6 or 7% mortgage can be almost impossible. And the way that we were able to kind of eke by is the fact that we had historically low interest rates for a long period of time post-2008. 3% mortgages allow people to buy really expensive homes, homes that are way too expensive for the incomes that they have. At 6 or 7%, that math doesn't work. And so this is a massive, massive change in this fundamental relationship, and there's plenty of boomers who are just not really thinking about that relationship. I think they are waking up to the fact when they see their kids and grandkids not be able to buy a house or afford rent in Portland or Seattle or whatever the case may be. And so I do think that is kind of coming around, and people are like, okay, this is really a problem because I want to see my grandkids. So I do think that the fundamental, both in terms of renting and in home ownership, the relationship between home values and incomes is totally out of whack. And that's happened in 40 years. And unfortunately, our children and those of you here at school right now are entering that, and that's tough. Like, it's totally unfair what we've done to your generation. And who benefited? Me and people older than me who've owned homes for 30 years. It's great. If I'm selfishly thinking solely about that, yeah, it's been really good for my financial situation. My home that I bought in Seattle in 2017 is up like 80%. And it's a levered investment, right? So my equity, almost as good as Google.
Great talk. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Just like there are a lot of, dubious or semi-plausible explanations for regional variations in homelessness, I think there are similar dubious but some semi-plausible explanations for regional variations in the housing market and regional variations in housing costs. And I feel like a book that addressed in a clear as way as your book did, knocking down some of those explanations like, private equity or greedy landlords, like coming to the conclusion that we have a real supply problem and it's more intense in these cities that have high housing costs. Have you thought about writing that book, or are you familiar with a book that would serve the equivalent purpose?
I'm busy, unfortunately, but to a certain extent, that's kind of this book. We basically make these arguments. We talk about why housing's really expensive in some places and not others. And there's a lot more literature on that now. Ezra Klein's book, Abundance, is kind of hitting this point. Why is it easier to build solar factories in Texas than it is in California? Why is it easier to build housing in Phoenix than it is in San Francisco? Really getting to this point. Obviously, he talked about other things as well. But I think there's a lot of juice on that idea now, and I think people are kind of coming to terms with that. And when I talk to elected leaders around the country, it's 5 years ago it wasn't there. Like right now, it's front and center. And so, another book would be great, but I think people might not buy it, but I don't think that it's a lack of communication on that issue. I've really seen a big change in 3 years all over the place on how people are thinking about this, which is good. That to me is one of the things that we write about in the book is that the interest in homelessness is an asset. Okay? One of the problems with climate change is it's like, I don't know, I recycle. I bought a hybrid car. It's so huge, I almost don't even know how to think about that. And so apathy is an issue with climate change, right? We don't have apathy with housing and homelessness. People are pissed off. I'm either outraged morally or I'm so irritated that this guy's urinating outside my restaurant. It's killing my business. People aren't like, oh, I don't care about homelessness. We don't have that. And so to me, if we think about that as kind of an asset in policy making, is that you harness that anger. And so what I say to folks is, come to the table. You're mad about the guy urinating? Come to the table, come on in. You're mad that your grandkids can't live in Seattle? Come on in. You think this is a moral outrage? Come on into the table. And so that to me is like getting people around the table saying, yeah, we have a shared goal of less of that, more housing and less of that. Okay, well, we might disagree on how to get there, that's fine. But at least we're having the conversation, and I think that table's happening in a lot of places. Every place I go, I end up doing side meetings, and it's like the mayor and the CEO of the hospital and the philanthropic community and all that, and it's like, and the police chief, and it's like, we need more housing, yep. It's really encouraging. Red places, blue places. Orlando, I had this meeting at this fancy club with all the kind of muckety-mucks in Orlando, and they're like, we need more housing. I'm like, yeah, no shit, guys, do it. So I'm encouraged by that, I really am.
Thank you so much for the talk,
Yep.
and I really enjoyed it. I was curious, you mentioned a little bit about how Portland doesn't fit into some of the trends that the data show, and I was curious how the solution that you would prescribe would differ for Portland as opposed to other places.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was hoping someone wouldn't ask that question. I firmly believe that more affordable housing would help the situation in Portland. I'm highly confident of that. Is that the sole issue here? Probably not. It's probably not the sole issue anywhere. Yours might be a little more complicated than others. So then some people say like, well, how much do we need, Greg? How much would fix it? And I was like, we're so far away, how about we just start? We could spend all our time figuring out like this number of units, that number of units, and to a certain extent, I care, intellectually I care, but like, I'm not worried about us going too far. How about we just start building and then we'll kind of see where we go? And so I do believe that fundamentally having access for people, housing access for people will be a good thing. Louisiana has the worst education, the worst drug problem, the worst economy in the United States, and they don't have a ton of homelessness. So those factors, while tragic, are not necessarily a recipe for guaranteed homelessness. And it doesn't need to be in Portland either. And so I still believe, I mean, I've gone this far, I can't give up now, right? But I firmly believe that more affordable housing would help here too. Do you have some other issues you have to attend to? Yeah, probably. And I think it's a bummer to, you know, it's just, your economy has just not been as strong as San Francisco and Seattle's, and that has made this more challenging here, because you just don't have the wealth that the other regions do in terms of tax base and employment and all that kind of stuff, but it's still expensive, and it's a tough situation to be in. So I don't envy your mayor or county exec. It's a hard job, it really is.
Is it on? Oh. Just like thinking about how the homelessness is the bigger issue in all of the big cities, where there also happens to be higher priced houses or rentals. How do you think the solution of like more affordable housing, cheaper housing, different alternatives, maybe smaller units, doesn't end up creating a situation where it's just like poor people, people of color, and they just end up congregating in these houses that are built for that they can afford perhaps, but then crime is rampant and drug use is also an issue and all of those things.
Yeah, so how do we prevent the fact that we build new housing that's affordable and we end up just kind of congregating poor people of color in these housing units, which is basically what we did with public housing, you know, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the United States. We had huge concentrations of race and poverty and had a variety of issues associated with that housing. So one, I don't think we're gonna do that again because there's zero political will in building that type of kind of high-rise concentrated housing. And so when people say to me, well, Greg, we don't want that, I'll say, I agree. And I don't think we need that kind of density. You know, when you think about what Minneapolis did in terms of their upzoning, what they said is it's legal to build 3 or 4 units on every parcel in the city that was formerly zoned single family. That's not Cabrini Green or high density public housing. What that is gentle density that can create a whole bunch more housing units. And so I think that we don't have to be Tokyo in Portland or really, really dense cities. What we need is more density than we have now. And that can be done gently, and that can be in ways such that the affordable housing is a little more distributed throughout the community. And so I think that's really, really important. The reality of the situation is where the dirt is cheaper, we're gonna build more affordable housing. Right, where the land is cheaper, it's easier to build affordable housing. And so generally speaking, we will see more affordable housing built in communities that are lower cost. And so the balance then is how do we make sure that we're not repeating prior mistakes of concentrations that are harmful. Hopefully, that affordable housing can be a source of kind of pride and growth for communities that have been subject to disinvestment. But we need to be really sensitive to the impacts of those communities. So that's a long-winded answer to a good question, which is, I don't think we're going to repeat the massive density issues, and we just need to be aware of that. And the reality is, you get more bang for your buck where land's cheaper. And so we do see that happening. But frankly, there are a lot of people in those communities who need that housing and would say, yeah, I'm happy to have more nicely built affordable housing in our community because this is where I live, this is where my social network is, and I don't want to have to move. Right? There's this big debate right now about the opportunity literature of do we move poor kids to wealthy neighborhoods and then their life's going to be great? And the counter argument is, why should they have to move? Why don't we invest in those neighborhoods such that they have good schools and good amenities and that they can live a productive life and don't have to move to Lake Oswego to have a good life, right? That's basically the argument, right? And so, I think the community development, community investment side is really important in this, while paying attention to the issues that you highlighted, which is complicated.
Much for a great talk. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.